Winnipeg's offseason is underway, and guess what? There are a ton of complicated questions about who should go, who should stay, and the future of this team. Let's talk about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Evening, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, we have quite a bit to talk about with the future of the Jets because, yesterday we sort of went over Rick Bowness retiring, and that sets up quite a bit of speculation, not only about who goes when it comes to the coaching staff, but also when it comes to the players. There's a lot of guys who are going to be up for extension or who are on expiring deals this upcoming season. And with the Jets kind of needing to change gears and perhaps rethink their approach to how they build their team, Winnipeg has a really good opportunity to sort of hit the reset button. I commented on Twitter that I said this upcoming season for me is not really focused on the playoffs and winning. And obviously you get some fans who are like, "What? Why aren't you building a team to win? That's what, we're here for." And it's like, yeah, okay. You have to look at it from a longer term perspective. And using next season as an evaluation period for me feels like it could be really beneficial, not only to figure out if the coaching staff fit is going to be the right, one to lead you forward, but also to figure out which of our young players and talents are really going to be suited to the NHL level. Are they going to get experience quickly? Will they acclimate rapidly? Will they need more time in the AHL if the NHL stint doesn't go well? So there's a lot to consider, but a year of growth for your prospects and the coaching staff and the room as a whole, especially with a new coach behind the bench, I think is a really valuable thing. Now, like I just said, there's going to be some roster changes, and I can see a few big ones coming here in the next couple of months. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but before we go any further, just wanted to let you know about our friends and partners at Monopoly Go. This fast-paced game lets you team up with friends for tournaments to unlock awesome prizes like unique stickers for trading, cool playing pieces, and hilarious emojis to taunt your friends. Download Monopoly Go, a great twist on the classic game, now free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. Like I said, the Jets have a complicated picture upcoming for, their roster, which I hate to say it, but we're about to see one of the biggest turnovers in Jets roster history. This is basically the last real hurrah of this core over the next year and a half, which means that there's going to be quite a few players who are going to be heading out the door sooner rather than later. And it leaves the Jets with a bit of a challenging situation to figure out. So looking at Winnipeg's roster, obviously you have a mixture of guys who are kind of like in their early to mid-20s, and then you have the rest of the older core that's closer to 30, which for me, I think signals that the Jets are sort of at a transition point. It's a bit of a tipping point, I guess you could call it, where the future's going to catch up to the Jets here pretty quickly, but the older guys are still plenty serviceable and productive. And so I don't think it's necessarily a bad place to be. I think the Jets have a good balance of veterancy and youth that's about to hit. And it's not that the youth are going to be leading the way in terms of immediately coming into this team and taking top line spots or anything like that. I don't think that's really the expectation. This team should be built more like the 2017-2018 Jets, where you had some good veterans forming the backbone, but then you filled in those gaps with ELCs and young talent. I think obviously the biggest guy who's really going to step in is going to be not Kobe Barlow. He's a little further off, but Brad Lambert obviously is going to be a big player. Ville Heinola will probably step in. That's my guess if he stays healthy. I think Nikita Chibrikov is also probably ready to get NHL minutes. He seems like he's a pretty good player. And, obviously we only have a short sample size with all of these kids, but there is reason to believe that they're going to be significantly impactful players. But for the upcoming season, right, who's going to be on the way out? Well, we have a couple of big names, Dylan DeMello, obviously Brendan Dillon, Laurent Brossoit, and I think for the Jets, it's a tough question because, you're looking at a number of different players that the Jets could bring back, but I think in a lot of ways, the Jets should limit how much they re-sign some of the existing core, which sounds strange to say, but like Tyler Toffoli, I think you should let him go. I like Toffoli. I think he's a great player. I don't think he's the right fit for this team. I think when you saw him in the playoffs, you really got a sense of his limitations. As much as like skating isn't the be-all, end-all for a player, I think in where the Jets are trying to go to and sort of the future of this team that they envision, he doesn't really have a place. I like him a lot. I think he's a great player. I don't think he's the kind of player that should be, somebody that you necessarily build the squad around, which I know sounds terrible. I don't really like saying that, but I think in terms of what the Jets need going forward and what, Toffoli is likely to want in an extension, it just doesn't feel like the right fit to me. Brendan Dillon, I'm a little more on the fence about because I really do like Dillon, and I think he's been significantly better than I expected when he was first acquired. I thought he'd be a solid second pairing guy, but at times he's played above that level. He's been great, great leadership, great voice. Like I said, I think the team really likes him, and I think he likes the fit. But the cap hit and what his next contract extension is probably going to look like, that's a bit of a sticking point. I think it's one of those situations where the Jets have younger players on the left side already that are ready to filter in, and Brendan might just need to cash in his final contract somewhere else, which sucks to say, but I will say that I'm very thankful that we got to watch him. He was a super fun player, and it seems like he will be, very much beloved and missed by the fan base. DeMello, though, I would probably prioritize re-signing DeMello. I know he's not the fastest these days. I know that this foot speed is kind of a problem, but in terms of being a really smart defender who is still a great right-sided option and can probably give you 2 to 3 more years of quality play, I think that is absolutely worth it. And, in terms of on-ice leadership and skill and everything, he ticks off all the boxes. So definitely make him one of your priority off-season signings. Sean Monahan, I think it's time for the Jets to also part ways with him. I like Monahan. I think that he's a nice center. He is not really the kind of guy that's going to be a bus driver, though. And I think that's where the Jets, they're still going to have a bit of a need here. And I know that people will say, well, you can't just not sign Monahan because then you're going to ask one of Lowry or Lambert to really step up. But you know what? I think that's not the worst. If you're looking at next season as a year for growth, obviously you don't want to give Brad Lambert tons of minutes immediately, but I think he's played more than enough pro hockey to where at this stage of his career, the next stage is starting to get maybe starting off with like third line minutes, right? Lowry, I think, has demonstrated that he can eat loads of minutes in the regular season. He's eaten like second line minutes almost this entire past year. So I don't really worry about that. I think with Lambert, there's an easier way to get him in. And if you make him perhaps your skilled center behind Scheifele and maybe, number 3 in time on ice deployments, because Lowry will probably eat up second line minutes, I think that could be a good way to sort of balance it out, right? I think that's perhaps one of the best options if you're the Jets. And, for Winnipeg, this could be a way to sort of introduce him in a somewhat insulated setting, but not to the point where he's not really having a major impact on this team. I think he's ready for a role, and I could definitely see it being a good thing. I'd also be interested in bringing Colin Miller back, but that depends on what the coaching staff's going to do. I like Colin. I think that he's a solid, third pairing defender. I think he provides good depth for the Jets. I think he would be a solid replacement if the Jets move Nate Schmidt, but that's obviously dependent on how they do that because Pionk and Schmidt definitely eat up a lot of cap space, and it sounds like Pionk is here to stay for the time being. So if they end up moving Schmidt, I think Miller would probably make sense to bring back on a cheap, maybe 2-year deal. Let him eat some minutes until the Jets start to get Elias Salomonsson up to speed. But after that, then Salomonsson can perhaps slide into Winnipeg's top 4. In terms of other guys I'd probably let go, obviously Stanley, I think it's time to part ways, and Brossoit needs to probably find, a starting role somewhere, because I think at this point, Brossoit, he's in his 30s. I think he really deserves the chance to go and find a place with another team where he can become a full-time player and perhaps finally get that starting role that has kind of eluded him. On the more underrated side, I'd probably do a cheap deal for David Gustafsson. I know Gus hasn't exactly lit the league on fire, but I still think he's a pretty decent player and somebody that I would personally like to see playing for the Jets in the future. But, in terms of the other players that are expiring, Perfetti, Heinola, guys like that, definitely re-sign them. I'm sure it's going to be short-term because, Perfetti and Heinola both haven't really been given prime roles with this team, but maybe this upcoming season is going to change that trend and we start to see them get more responsibility. So there's a lot of change upcoming for this team. There is one player that I haven't talked about who's technically not expiring this offseason, but I think we all know that our time with him is running short, and that, of course, is Nikolaj Ehlers. We'll talk about what to expect with that because it's going to be a huge mess, and I think the Jets are probably going to lose that deal when it happens, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Before we go too much further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Monopoly Go. Game off, we've got to take time to pause here and talk more about Monopoly Go. I know what you're saying, flag on the play. Didn't you mention them earlier? Well, yep, you're right. I will fully admit that. But as somebody who is actually a Monopoly fan himself, I played when I was younger. I think Monopoly Go is a great alternative, a great twist on the classic formula because you can team up with friends for time tournaments where you can work together to build up each other's boards. And the more you win together, the more awesome prizes you can unlock. There's stuff like unique stickers that you can trade with your friends, new playing pieces to use in game, just like, getting the classic little dog or perhaps something a little more modern. You can also unlock hilarious emojis for when you tear down your friends' properties or when you steal from their treasured bank vaults. Monopoly Go always feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. They also include their own unique mini-games like digging for treasure or a robot pachinko machine. There's always new timed events to help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go, so get off the bench and go download it now free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on! Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just talking about Winnipeg's upcoming season, which is going to be, quite a complicated thing. I think Winnipeg has a lot to do, and I think a lot of big and hard decisions to make, but perhaps none are bigger than the Nikolaj Ehlers situation, which feels like it's reaching a fever pitch with this team. And, with the Jets looking at a guy who probably doesn't want to resign and doesn't really have any incentive to as of yet, I got to be honest, it's not feeling great. Before we dive into some of the ramifications of that and what to expect, just wanted to let you know that the Locked On NFL mock draft is available now. Find the ultimate 6-episode series on Locked On NFL Draft to hear who our Locked On experts picked for every NFL franchise with live reactions from local college experts and the fantasy angle. The Locked On NFL mock draft is available now on Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Now, you'll notice I titled this situation or this segment the Tricky Nicky situation. And I think it really is tricky because if you look at what Ehlers' body of work represents over the past few years, you see pretty decent counting stats. A guy who's probably putting up, if you prorated it, second to top line scoring, in terms of relative to his deployments. His rate scoring is very high. He is one of Winnipeg's highest 5v5 scorers, especially given the amount of time that he plays, which tends to be somewhere in the middle six territory. And obviously, we know that Ehlers is a great player. There's never really been a question about that. I think with people, they tend to look at him in a couple of different ways. One thing is that he's just fast. I think that's a really simplistic way of looking at it. As much as it is true that he is flat or that he is the Flash and he definitely moves up the ice expediently, it's what he does with the skating that's a big deal. He's a phenomenal puck carrier, right? Like a huge transition expert. The guy is just dynamite when he's in possession. And he also gets the puck up the ice really quickly because he's so good at carving through the neutral zone and doing offensive zone entries. We don't really have many players on this team who have that kind of skill set, which sounds dumb to say, but it is true. It is a unique skill set, and I think for Winnipeg, one that they're actually lacking in, at least until Lambert gets up to speed. Apparently, people compare Lambert to Ehlers, which can only be good things for the Jets because Lambert, if he develops into that sort of player with his effortless skating, is going to be an unholy menace at space creation. So there's a lot to like there. The problem with Ehlers is that, aside from his injury history and stuff, which is actually pretty pronounced, the other situation that you run into is that he doesn't really have counting stats of like a number one kind of winger, which means that if you're trading him, I don't know if the Jets are really going to get fair value. We all know internally that Ehlers is a great player and perhaps somebody who should have been on the top line to begin with, but other teams are going to use the lack of scoring, the disputes that he's had with coaches in terms of his deployments, and some other stuff as perhaps evidence that he's really not worth a major trade package. And with a guy expiring on his last deal at the age of 28, needing a big contract extension, I just don't know if the Jets are really dealing with a lot of leverage here. Now, there's always a chance that things turn around and Ehlers does, in fact, decide to come back, but I've got to be honest. I just don't see it. I really don't. I think at this point, unless something drastic happens, Winnipeg has probably burned that bridge. I think the amount of times that he has been demoted off the top line or out of the top six, and the seeming double standards that he has to deal with in comparison to some of his teammates, it has to be frustrating. And it's been years of this. If it'd be one thing if it was just like a couple of times, but it's been like the last 6 or 7 years that he's had to deal with this stuff constantly. And so for me, I think the only thing that's going to happen is that he gets traded. And I know people are talking about getting a top 4D in return. It's not happening, right? Unless some team really feels generous, I think the Jets would be very fortunate to get a quality defender in return. There's options out there, and it is possible, but for an expiring winger, I just don't see it. I think Winnipeg is going to run into a situation where players like that are really highly valued. And, given how the Jets tend to evaluate defenders anyways, I don't know if I really trust them to make that trade. I got to be honest. We'd probably end up with somebody like Ristolainen instead, which isn't great. Ristolainen may look a little bit better with the Flyers, but I don't want him on the Jets. I really don't. And I think that there's not many defenders that I would trade for to begin with. So don't love that. I think that would not be great. I also don't think the Jets should really keep Ehlers, and I hate to say it because, you could treat him as an internal rental, but I just don't really think that's the best use of assets. Because if he ends up kind of walking in free agency and the Jets don't really have much of a playoff push, well, then there's not really much point to keep him, right? It would only be if you really think that the Jets next season are going to be really good. And we have honestly not much of an idea of what this team is even going to look like. So I think for all those reasons and for the amount of uncertainty, it might just make sense to cash out while you still can and get some assets back. I don't know what assets you would get. I think you'll get some decent stuff, but it's not going to be anything to write home about. So, it is a tough situation, and I don't like thinking about it in these terms. It does seem a little negative, maybe even uncharitable if we're talking about the Jets and sort of my assessment of that. But, at the end of the day, Winnipeg kind of has put itself in this situation. And at this rate, they're going to have to kind of live with the consequences, much as it's not fun to say. I think Winnipeg has kind of made its bed a little bit, and that's sort of just the way it is. I do think that there's a chance that things could be repaired eventually, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And I think for the Jets, it's probably just best to prepare for the future without Ehlers. That's going to be hard. You're going to lose a really talented skater that quite honestly fits the direction the Jets are going. They're talking about wanting to get faster and more skilled. That's Ehlers in a nutshell. So it's tough. It's tough. We're not going to have an immediate replacement. I mean, Lambert's the closest thing, and that's a lot to ask of him. And I don't think that losing one of your players and then just replacing him with a rookie or something is really that great. Because then you're not really benefiting from an increase in the quality of your overall squad. You're just getting slightly younger, which is great, but it doesn't really solve, Winnipeg's lack of speed up and down the lineup. So, yeah, it is a bit of a quandary, a bit of a catch-22. But you also can't let him go into the sunset without getting something for him. So, yeah, don't love that situation. I can't say that I'm real happy with how the team has handled that part. It's one of the few areas where I think the Jets have legitimately had a bit of a misstep, but it just is what it is, isn't it? There's not much else to say about it. So let's just hope that the Jets make the right decision. Now, we're going to pause on Jets off-season coverage there just because, obviously, for as much as there is to talk about, stuff is still fresh and still developing. And guess what? The playoffs are still ongoing. So wanted to spend a few moments talking about the start of round 2 and some really fun things. And hopefully, you're catching up on some of the great games. Maybe you've seen some highlights, or if you're like me and still actually wanting to watch some playoff hockey, maybe to satisfy that itch, let me know what series you've been watching and if any have really impressed you in the comments below. But we'll talk about that in just a moment. Before we go any further, though, just wanted to talk a bit about FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big victory of your own. Sure, the Jets might be out of the playoffs for the NHL and, well, also the NFL. Let's be honest, right? The New York Jets and the Winnipeg Jets share some very similar playoff fates when it comes to professional sports. But hey, only one of those teams actually had a chance recently. So if you're wanting to kind of capitalize on some of the other playoff action that's happening, whether you're following the craziness of the NBA like the Denver Nuggets and stuff, or some of the other super teams that are out there, well, guess what? If you haven't used FanDuel before, this is a great time to get in, because right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode. We're just wrapping up with some final thoughts. Round 2 for the playoffs has finally kicked off, and honestly, we've seen some really interesting games so far. Carolina has now found themselves in a 2-0 hole after surrendering 4 goals in back-to-back games. They've been very close, mind you, 4-3 losses, but by the same token, double OT loss just now to New York probably puts the Canes very much on the back foot. I think this is probably one of the worst situations you could be in because, for the Canes, having to come back from a 2-0 series deficit, obviously, they were road games that they were playing, but it is really tough. The Rangers are a good squad. Igor Shesterkin looks like he's unbeatable. And so, this might be a little bit of a hole that's insurmountable. I think for Jets fans, one of the reasons you might be wondering about this particular series is because Rod Brind'Amour might be leaving Carolina. Now, I don't think that's really going to happen. My guess is they've basically figured out most of the terms of a contract extension. It's just sort of working out the details from there and figuring that part out. That's probably still to be determined. The money and financial side of things is always where stuff gets complicated. So I think that's probably where the hiccup is. But if the Canes do lose, and assuming that they lose in a bad way in like a sweep, and Brind'Amour does become available, I think about it. I don't know what the offer from Dundon's office is right now for the extension, but if the Jets legitimately have a shot to bring in Brind'Amour and he'd be willing to move to Winnipeg, I think you should definitely take it. Look, he's got some stylistic things that I don't love about the way that his teams create offense. I think that there were some issues in past years where finishing was definitely not the best, but if you look at their record of playoff success, generally speaking, and their overall consistency, the Canes are a great team. I know that I have some reservations about some of the ways that their roster has been built, but in terms of overall success, it's hard to argue with the result. And honestly, Brind'Amour would definitely be the best coach the Jets have ever had. I think in terms of his offensive ambitions, his systems approaches, all that stuff, I think he would be amazing for this team. And he's not afraid to use young players. That, I think, is a really underappreciated aspect. And so, look, I don't want to say that he's definitely leaving the Canes because I don't think that's the case. But if he does, and the Jets have a shot, you might just want to hand him a blank check. I know that's not really how Winnipeg operates, but in terms of coaching candidates who could become available over the next few weeks or are currently available, I got to say Rod is really up there for me as one of the most premier options and somebody who I could think or I could foresee making the Jets not only good in the future, but also next season. Maybe they even make the playoffs under him next year with some good growth with the kids. So stuff to consider. But among the other series, obviously Edmonton, Vancouver hasn't started yet, but we've got Colorado and Dallas currently underway. That is the first game right now. Dallas leads 3-2, but the Avs have staged a bit of a heroic comeback. They are a dangerous team. They just don't ever seem to quit. despite having a really bad first period, the second period has looked a lot more like the Avs of old. So interesting series to track. I think a lot of us are kind of keeping an eye to see if Colorado really is the Cup favorite kind of team, or if it was just that the Jets were that bad. Maybe we sort of watch it because we want to feel a little bit less bad about how the Jets were in the playoffs. I don't know. I just think it's good hockey. Dallas has played at a really high level, and honestly, even if the Jets had advanced to this round, the Stars might have, cleaned us out badly. So either way, I think Winnipeg's fate was probably sealed, but at least, if the Avs also get knocked out, we can feel good about the fact that the Stars probably would have handled their business against us too. One of the other games that's actually kicked off recently, of course, Boston and Florida. Tough series so far. Boston basically wiped the floor with Florida 5-1. I don't know that was really on my prediction card, but wow, pretty crazy series. That should be an interesting one to see how the Panthers respond in game 2. They usually don't stay down for long, and maybe it was just the rest after taking the Lightning out in just a few games. But, we'll see, right? The Panthers obviously aren't going to sweat things too much. They know that they have the much better team. But if Swayman kind of goes goblin mode in this playoff run, maybe that's going to be a bit of an underrated storyline. I think goaltending this second round is going to be a huge deal. I think it's going to be a factor in some of these really tight series, especially like the Dallas one, where Ottinger is probably better than Georgiev. And in, the Canes-Rangers series, Shesterkin is definitely the stronger of the two between him and Anderson. So a lot of stuff to keep track of, but we will continue to follow the playoffs, provide you updates, and also give you some more Jets off-season coverage as we start approaching the more fun months. But one last note of interest, the San Jose Sharks have won the draft lottery. One of the first times in many, many years that the draft order actually didn't change, even post-lotto. So congrats to the Sharks. You tanked well. I guess you're going to enjoy the benefits of suckage. I hate to say it, but that's probably the best way to describe it. But, if you're the fan base and you've been long suffering for the last few years, well, you're probably feeling pretty good about Macklin Celebrini. So we'll kind of look into Jets prospect coverage over the next few weeks. Obviously, a little bit more distant and in the periphery of our conversation, but something to think about for the future. The Jets don't have a lot of picks at this upcoming draft, but hey, maybe they can still fish out something decent. So keep an eye out for that. But for tonight's episode, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much, as always, for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow for even more Jets coverage. So see you then. Have a great one. And as always, go Jets go.